This is episode 3 of Old Testament Jesus, and I'm really interested in sharing with you how the story of Jesus comes alive when we understand a little bit about the Old Testament. So in this episode, our topic relates to Jesus' birth, of course, and specifically to the town of Bethlehem. So Bethlehem, a tiny little town in Judah, about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. And this town is going to play a really big role in the New Testament story. You see, Bethlehem was the center of the events at the time of Jesus' birth, the place where the shepherds gathered to see a newborn baby lying in the manger, where the wise men from the east were led by the star, and where, sadly, many children under the age of 2 were slain by the jealousy of King Herod. And you've heard the name so many times that you probably just take it for granted. But why Bethlehem? Why did God choose this place for the birth of his only son? And why did God choose to reveal this to one of the prophets of Israel 700 years before it happened? Now we're going to start in the Gospel of John, chapter 7. And that might seem like a very unlikely spot to start. But in John chapter 7, thousands of Jews are gathered in the city of Jerusalem. They're there to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And the crowds, like crowds do, were debating. Everyone had their own opinion. And reading this chapter always makes me laugh a little bit. The crowds in Jerusalem, they're just so confused. There's one statement that says this, another that says that, and the next statement is completely contradictory to the first. And in fact, it gets quite amusing if you read through John chapter 7, especially when we as the readers know the truth about Jesus. Now, just a little bit about the setting. Jesus has been preaching for about 3 years, and in less than a year, he's going to be betrayed and crucified. And the people have seen all his miracles, but the excitement is beginning to wear off. There's a lot of doubts about who Jesus is. His teaching is controversial. He demands a lot from those that want to be his disciples. And the religious leaders have turned into his enemies. They're seeking to kill him. And not only that, they're persecuting anyone who would believe. And so the confusion of the crowd all centers around Jesus, whether Jesus is the Messiah or not. There's those that believe he is, and there's those who believe he is not. And how can they tell? How would they know if Jesus was the Messiah? Well, the test that seems most obvious from the conversation in John chapter 7 is where Jesus comes from. They're all arguing about Jesus' origin. And you start to notice that each of the individuals there has an opinion, and there was lots of people there. So there's this man in verse 27, if you want to look it up at some point, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, well, you know what? We shouldn't know where the Messiah comes from. And his argument is, well, we know exactly where Jesus came from, and the Bible doesn't tell us where the Messiah will come from. Now, he's wrong, of course, but that was the argument. They knew he was from Galilee, the town of Nazareth, and probably those that knew him as a child and a young man probably had trouble believing that the son of a carpenter in Nazareth was the Messiah, the Son of God. Well, then there's a group in verse 41 that say, and I paraphrase, the Messiah doesn't come from Galilee. And their argument is, it really doesn't matter where he's from, but it can't be Galilee. You know, Galilee was a despised place. Think of that city or town in your area that everyone looks down on. Well, that was Galilee. One of the disciples, when he was first introduced to Jesus, said, "Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Now, it wasn't just that it was a despised town. The religious leaders had a more doctrinal reason why he couldn't come from Galilee. And their argument was that the scriptures never anywhere predicted a prophet from Galilee. And they actually are quite proud of their knowledge of the scriptures. And they talk about the people as being cursed because they don't know the law like they did. Now, here's the most incredible part, is that that group that earlier said he doesn't come from Galilee, well, they made another statement. They said, the Messiah comes from Bethlehem. The Bible says so. And they're absolutely right. But the ironic thing is that somehow they don't know that that is exactly where Jesus was born. So they don't know that he's from Galilee, from the city. They only know, that he's from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth. So here's the point. The people are making one of the most important decisions of their life. Are they going to accept Jesus as Messiah or no? And they're rejecting him for two reasons. One, because they don't know and understand the Old Testament. And two, if they do, they don't have the facts. So there's essentially this life or death decision. Are you going to listen to Jesus and his message, or are you going to put him to death on the cross? That's what's taking place in John chapter 7. Now, just stop for a minute and imagine that the Messiah, or Jesus Christ, was going to return to the earth in our day. Imagine that the Messiah came today and you didn't recognize him. Now, that's not as far-fetched as it seems. The Bible actually says that the same thing is going to happen again, just like it did 2,000 years ago. I'll come back to that at the end. But if we go back to our story about Bethlehem, the closest that any of the crowd on that day in Jerusalem came to the truth was the group that said the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. They were the ones that knew the Old Testament, that knew the prophecy. They just somehow didn't ask the right question to find out that Jesus was born under unusual circumstances in that town. But do you know that the predictions about Jesus' origin were so precise that if you knew your Old Testament well, there should have been no doubt about the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. And I want to take you through really quickly 3 passages that come from the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew, in one chapter, Matthew alerts us of 3 prophecies about where Jesus would come from. And I want to take you to the very first. Now, remember that there were wise men that came from the east. These are the ones that knew about Daniel's prophecy. Remember episode 2 and the prophecy of the 70 weeks of Daniel? Well, because of that prophecy, they were alerted to come to the land of Israel, knowing that a king was to be born. But they come to Israel and they don't know where to go. And so they come to King Herod and they say to him, where is the Messiah going to be born? Where's the King of the Jews going to be born? And of course, he has no idea. He's just worried about the potential of a rival king. So he calls together the Jewish leaders, all the religious leaders, and he asks them. And of course, they're familiar with the Old Testament. And they tell him that the Messiah is to come from the family of King David and is to be born in Bethlehem. So here's a map of the land. This is the city or town of Bethlehem. And in Matthew chapter 6, we're told, thus it is written by the prophet, and that would be the prophet Micah, thou Bethlehem in the land of Judah art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. So the religious leaders knew from this verse that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. And they're actually referencing Micah chapter 5, verse 2. You can turn to Micah and you can look up that prophecy. But Matthew goes on to tell us 2 more things, 2 more prophecies about Jesus' origin. So you keep reading through Matthew chapter 2, and you learn that Jesus and his parents fled to Egypt, just for a short period of time. Now remember what Herod did. Herod was concerned that there was a rival king that was going to be born in Bethlehem. And he asked the wise men to come back and tell him when they find him, because he wanted to kill him. But the wise men, of course, go home a different route. And Herod was furious. But before Herod was able to kill all the children in Bethlehem, an angel warned Joseph and Mary to flee to Egypt and to take Jesus with them. And that fulfilled a second prophecy. And Matthew alerts us to this. He alerts us to this in verses 5 and 6. And he references that Jesus was going to come out of Egypt. God was going to call his son out of Egypt. It's actually a quote from Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1. Now, in order for God to call Jesus, his son, out of Egypt, well, the circumstances had to send him there. And of course, the angel appeared and told them to go there so that they could have their lives saved. So if you're following the prophecies and you know the history from the Old Testament, and you know the details of Jesus' early days, you're starting to be convinced that this boy is the Messiah. But wait, there's one more. So after the death of Herod, the angel appears to Joseph and Mary and tells them it's okay. You can go back to the land. It's safe to go back to the land of Israel. But instead of returning to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, they go to Nazareth in Galilee and take up residence there. And it's at this point that Matthew highlights that this was actually in fulfillment of a third prophecy that was given in the Old Testament. So he quotes and he says, "They came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene." A Nazarene, or a resident of Nazareth. Now, this one's a little bit harder to find in the Old Testament. You have to look at the original Hebrew, but you'll find a reference to this if you look at the Hebrew in Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1. All right, now imagine that you're living 2,000 years ago. Imagine that you have this understanding of the Old Testament. You know that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. You know that somehow he's going to go to Egypt and come back out of Egypt, and that when he does, he's going to end up in the city of Nazareth. He's going to be from the tribe of Judah, and he's going to be a descendant of King David. So now you find yourself 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles. You've paid attention. You've asked some questions about Jesus. And there's this very confusing discussion all around you of whether Jesus is the Christ. And when the comment comes, we won't know where the Messiah comes from, you say to yourself, but hey, wait a second, we do. There's lots of detail that's given in the prophets. And when someone else says he can't come from Galilee, you think, well, wait a second, the scriptures say he's going to be a Nazarene. And when others rightly refer to the prophecy about Bethlehem, but somehow don't know the miraculous events that brought Joseph and Mary to the city of David, you can set them straight and say, look, I looked into it. He was born in Bethlehem. In fact, that was the reason that there was a census that took Mary and Joseph back to their hometown where David came from. It's amazing. And what you really learn is the power of knowing the scriptures and the Old Testament connections. And really, if you lived at that time, it could be a matter of making the right decision about Jesus or making the wrong decision, and like the leaders, putting the Messiah to death. Now, the thing is that the Bible tells us this scenario is going to play out again. When Jesus returns to the earth sometime soon, he's going to become king. He's going to build a temple, and he's going to defeat the powers of the world. And he's going to ask the people of the world to become his subjects. All of this is prophesied in the Bible. So what are we going to do when that happens? Are we going to recognize Jesus and accept him? Or are we going to misidentify him and reject him as the religious people did 2,000 years ago? Because the Bible tells us there will be some who, when Jesus comes, will reject him. They won't recognize him. They won't understand that he's the Messiah. They're going to do the exact same thing that some of the Jewish religious leaders did 2,000 years ago. And they're going to do that because they don't know the scriptures. And so there's a real importance of knowing what the Bible says and what it doesn't say. But I just want to finish off with the story of Jesus' earliest days. It's a remarkable portion of Jesus' life. Jesus is just a child, and yet even in the first 2 years of his life, its details are completely woven into the Old Testament. It's a marvelous journey that we get to follow. And the question becomes then, well, why Bethlehem? That's the question we started with at the beginning of our session. Why this tiny little town in the middle of Judea? Well, of course, it was to fulfill the prophecy of Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But there's a little bit more. It wasn't just to fulfill that prophecy, it was what the prophecy said. You see, the city of Bethlehem was one of the least consequential in the nation. Jesus wasn't destined to come from Jerusalem, the capital. He wasn't born to the family of the high priest. He was born in a poor, inconsequential town in a manger. But Bethlehem did have one claim to fame. It was the city of King David, because Jesus was born to sit upon David's throne. And so by having Jesus born in Bethlehem, the Bible is basically telling us to go back and to look at the Old Testament and to look at the life of David. It's one of those prompts that careful Bible readers are given. And if you keep reading the Bible, you'll start to see all these prompts for yourself. God is telling us to go back and to look at the first king who was born in Bethlehem, David, the shepherd king of Israel, the man after God's own heart. And if you stick with us, that's just what we're going to do in the rest of our session.